Charleston, July 4th, 1839. The city's heart pounds beneath a mantle of gunpowder and magnolias, the air thick with the scent of roasting pork and spilled wine, every window aglow with candlelight. In the grand houses, men in broadcloth toast to liberty, their voices rising above the percussion of rockets that split the summer night. One man counts the hours, not the fireworks. His name is Samuel, though few will say it aloud after tonight. In the plantation kitchen, sweat rolls down his temples as he salts a haunch of venison, his fingers brushing the meat's grain, the salt gritting between his skin and the flesh. The copper pots and iron skillets, burnished by 1,000 meals, glint dully in the lamplight, casting mottled shadows on the plaster walls. Charleston's elite fill themselves on stories of birthright and freedom, their forks scraping fine china, their laughter cresting and falling like the distant tide. The city's cobblestones still hold the day's heat. The air is close, almost suffocating, as if even the sky is holding its breath. In the kitchen, Samuel exhales slowly, his bare feet cool on the slate floor, his eyes flicking to the door every few minutes. He reaches for the salt cellar again, a common object, unremarkable, save for what it conceals. The cook, perhaps sensing something amiss, has gone quiet, polishing pewter with a rough cloth. The rhythm of work is both shield and prison. No one thinks to mark the moment when Samuel's tally quietly rises. There is beauty in the ordinary, in the way a woman in white silk adjusts her sleeve, in the way ice clinks in a glass, in the way a slave's hands betray nothing as he seasons a dish. Accounts suggest 12 men will taste Samuel's work before sunrise. The records name them only as property owners, their wealth and arrogance as fixed as the iron cuffs the sheriff keeps in the lockup. Their faces are flushed with drink, their coats stretched across broad shoulders, their conversations braided with boasts and business. In the kitchen, there is no boast, only calculation. Samuel measures his breaths, his pulse steady, his mind moving from the roast to the root cellar, from the cellar to the cistern, from the cistern to the gate. He watches, listens, waits for the first cough, for the first uncertain glance, for the first clue that his act has registered. The city hums with merriment, the noise a narcotic lullaby. No one notices when the serving boy passes the tray lopsided, his hand trembling. The meat is passed, the wine poured, the first toast drunk. The fireworks burst overhead in blue and gold, echoing across the harbor, casting the city in a spectral glow. Could a man at the center of such noise ever be truly seen? In Charleston, a master knows every detail of his holdings, the height of his cotton, the yield of his cane, the number of bricks in his chimneys. Yet in the kitchen, a slave's motions become invisible, folded into the architecture of service. Samuel moves from task to task. The knife in his hand feels both familiar and strange, its edge catching the light, its edge biting into the apple for the master's cheese tray. The scent of cinnamon and nutmeg rises, almost masking the bitterness of the tincture he has added. Accounts imply this recipe is an old one, whispered between women at the market, gleaned from a trader with hands scored by poppy fields, recorded in no ledger. The kitchen is a world of order, its routines as fixed as the stars, the grinding of the coffee, the setting of the table, the stacking of plates by height and pattern, the servant's dress pinned neat across the chest. But beneath the surface, invisible to the diners, a current moves against the tide, dark and relentless. Would you have seen him that night, moving among the silver and linen, among the laughter and the lies? Would you have sensed the stillness in him, the absence of chatter, the way his breath fell into step with the grandfather clock in the hall? In the cellar, the rats scurry in the damp, their nails scraping the stones, the scent of mildew and age rising from the barrels. On the table above, the first master pushes back his chair, his face suddenly ashen, a tremor running through his hands. He coughs, drinks, coughs again, a sound easily dismissed amid the clamor. The widow, her silk rustling, leans in for reassurance, but the master's mouth works soundlessly, his fingers digging into the tablecloth. No one rises to help. The music swells, spilling from the parlor into the street. The candles gutter in a draught, their wax pooling on the brass holders. The kitchen door creaks, as it always does, on rusted hinges, A gust of air carries the mingled odors of cooking fat and spilled gin. Samuel does not look up, but his pulse quickens, though his fingers remain steady as he salts another cut of meat. The city does not stir for the muffled thud that follows, the sound so like a dropped dish, so easily lost in the din. A servant girl, her face unreadable, picks up a fallen napkin, her fingers lingering on the linen. The clock marks another quarter hour. The fireworks spend themselves in the sky. A final salvo, a brief silence, then murmurs of admiration and relief. In the kitchen, a hand, Samuel's, brushes the rim of the salt cellar, fingertips tracing its curve, as if to etch the moment into memory. The night is not yet over. The storm gathers just beyond the harbor, but for now, only Samuel knows its true direction, its weight, its teeth. The air tightens, the city unaware, the earth turning beneath them all, indifferent as iron. Everyone can hear the silence between footsteps on Charleston's shell paths, yet only now does the city notice the quiet in its own kitchens. The plantation stirs with a rumor that tastes metallic, not quite sweat, not yet blood, but anticipation that curls through the hallways like smoke from a banked fire. The morning after the feast, the overseer's boots ring on the floorboards, and a new stillness gathers in the slave quarters as if each breath is rationed. Samuel ties his apron, his hands unhurried, his back to the door. Sunlight slants through the shutters, catching the dust motes that dance above the flour sacks and iron kettles. Out back, hounds nose at scraps, their nails clicking on brick. In the great house, a maid pinches her skirt between thumb and forefinger and waits for someone to speak. The widow of the dead master demands answers before breakfast is served, her voice pitched high enough to carry through the pantry door. A doctor, summoned from town, sniffs at the dregs in a coffee cup and frowns. Was it indigestion or something sharper, more deliberate? He runs his hand over the fine linen of the tablecloth, the weave soft, the fabric unmarked, every thread in place. In the kitchen, Samuel lifts a spoon from the boiling pot, letting droplets fall onto the slate hearth, where they hiss and disappear. His gaze flicks to the pantry, to the small ceramic jar tucked behind barrels of molasses, its lid crusted with salt. Accounts suggest poison was rare in Charleston, punishable by death, yes, but more often imagined than discovered. The city's laws were strict. Any slave accused of harming a master faced trial by a jury of property owners who valued their own survival above all. The cook, a woman who had kneaded grief into bread for 20 years, watches Samuel from the corner of her eye, her lips pressed tight, her rolling pin creaking against the dough. The kitchen smells of yeast and lard, of mornings after feast days, when even the ashes hold the scent of burnt sugar and cinnamon. Samuel listens for the scrape of the overseer's stool, for the creak of the ledger's spine, for the question that has not yet been asked. He breathes in, breathes out, each exhale measured, each gesture deliberate, no different from any other morning. Would you start a rumor if you knew it might save your own life? Or would you swallow your knowledge, let it turn to salt in your mouth, to iron in your veins? The widow, resplendent in her mourning silks, sips sweet tea and insists there must be some mistake. In the background, a clock ticks mindlessly, and the plantation waits, suspended between suspicion and routine. The oven door swings open, letting out a draft of warm air that rustles the pages of the ledger left on the counter. The overseer counts heads, notes absences, writes numbers in neat columns. Everything is accounted for, or so it seems. The clink of a teacup on saucer breaks the silence, sharp as a dropped coin, and Samuel crosses to the window, his shadow stretching long across the scarred work table. No one speaks his name, and for now, he is only a pair of hands, only a murmur in the kitchen's quiet war. The storm has not broken, but the air is heavy, the city still as a held breath, the night's noise fading into memory, into the long silence that will follow. 3. Ledgers and lies. Plantation records do not tell stories. They keep accounts. In the overseer's office, the ledger's pages crackle as they turn, each line an entry, each name a price paid in silver or in flesh. Samuel's purchase is noted in a clerk's script. Male 28Y, skilled $600. No mention of his hands, quick and sure with a knife, nor of the scars crosshatched on his back from the overseer's whip. The office smells of ink and dust, of paper aged yellow at the edges, of sweat ground into desk wood over decades of calculation. Outside, cicadas grind their wings in the noonday heat. A horse stamps in the yard, its harness jingling. The plantation is silent, except for the scribe's quill, scraping the page, inscribing absences and debts as immutable as the tide. The rules that govern Samuel's life are written in the same steady hand that documents cotton bales and livestock. Charleston's slave code demands curfews, bans assemblies, prohibits literacy, small laws, small tools, but sharp enough to draw blood if challenged. In the kitchen, Samuel reaches for a bottle of vinegar, the glass cool against his palm, the sharp scent cutting through the kitchen's warmth. He remembers the day he was brought here, the rough hemp rope around his wrists, the sun hot on his bare shoulders, the overseer reciting numbers from the ledger as if they were scripture. Now, as he wipes down the tabletop, the grain of the wood worn smooth beneath his hand, he wonders whose name will be struck from the book next. The ledger is supposed to be complete, but one page is missing, torn out, perhaps, or burned. The overseer, his sleeves rolled above meaty forearms, frowns as he searches for a date, a detail, a confession. The plantation is built on such ledgers, on the fiction that every life can be reduced to entries and exits, to numbers marching in neat rows, yet silence itself can be an act of defiance, a missing page, a story half told, a man whose worth cannot be calculated in coins. In the kitchen, Samuel lifts a knife, the blade catching the light, the edge sharp enough to slice a thread from a sleeve or a line from a page. Would you burn a story to save yourself? Or would you let it live in the quiet between entries? In Charleston, names can be erased, but some memories are too bitter to disappear. The plantation is silent, but not empty. Voices drift up from the slave quarters, laughter and laments woven together, the sounds both a comfort and a threat. Samuel runs his thumb along the ledger's edge, feeling the roughness where a page was removed. The overseer watches him from across the room, his eyes narrowed, his breath sour with tobacco. Outside, the sun beats down, bleaching the stones of the courtyard, the air shimmering with heat. The rustle of a missing page is the only answer the plantation will give today. Samuel turns away, the ledger's secret still buried, the truth hovering somewhere between the lines, between the silences, between the clink of the overseer's cup and the sound of a pen scratching at the edge of history. Plantation ledgers do not record stories. They do not confess, do not weep, do not ask forgiveness. Charleston, 1839, in the overseer's office, morning light fingers the dust above the desk, where a ledger lies open, its pages stiff as parchment, the overseer's hands, square, ink-stained, thick with authority, turn each sheet with care, as if reverence could make fair what is built on backs and bones. With his left hand, he plucks a quill from the stand, the nib scrapes the ink pot, leaves a black smear on the rim. The plantation's business is written here, bushels of rice, barrels of molasses, the weight of cotton, the price of iron, and the names of men, women, children bought and sold. Samuel's purchase is entered in a steady, cursive hand, male 28 years, skilled $600. In Charleston, a ledger is as close to gospel as a man can get. The law that protects the entries is as old as the city itself. A slave cannot learn his letters. A slave cannot carry a note. A slave cannot raise his hand in anger, in grief, in hope, unless his master permits it. The code is not secret. It sits on the desk next to the inkwell, its leather binding cracked, its pages crowded with ordinances and prescriptions. The overseer consults it from time to time, licking a thumb to turn a page. The wood of the chair shifts beneath his weight, and the office smells of sweat and paper dust, of tobacco packed into a tin, of the river mud tracked onto the floorboards. Outside, a cicada saws at the heat, and a horse's bridle jingles as it tosses its head. Samuel, in the kitchen, picks up a pewter dish, polishes the rim with his sleeve. The metal is cool, dented from years of use. the damp cloth hisses against the curve. Ledgers do not dream. They do not ask what a boy might have become, if his mother had been allowed to keep him, if his father's name had been written anywhere but in the margins. Samuel's hands move with routine, the grinding of the coffee, the stoking of the hearth, the laying out of the plates by size and pattern. He does not look up when the overseer enters the kitchen, ledger tucked beneath his arm, his boots heavy on the slate. The overseer reads the numbers aloud, as if they are prophecy. 12 bags of meal, 6 hams, half a barrel of salt. Samuel nods, fetches the salt from the pantry, a small ceramic jar, the glaze worn smooth by work-worn hands. The overseer watches him, hard-eyed, silent as Samuel measures what is needed for the day's meals. The cupboard door creaks when Samuel returns the jar, the sound sharp in the close air. Would you see yourself in the entries? If your life were reduced to lines in a book, would you recognize your own name, spelled in a stranger's hand, valued less than a brood mare, less than a cask of rum? In the overseer's office, the ledger is supposed to be a history, an archive of facts, but here is the truth. One page is missing, torn out perhaps, or maybe burned, for reasons no one will say. The overseer turns the leaves with care, searching for a date, a detail, a confession. His fingers hesitate where the book's spine has split open, where the stitching shows through. The plantation is built on such books, on the fiction that lives can be rendered in copperplate, that suffering can be summed and subtracted, and yet silence, too, is a weapon. A missing page, a story half told, a man whose worth cannot be reckoned in dollars. Samuel does not speak unless asked. He wipes down the kitchen table, his brow damp, the cloth scratching over the wood. His hands are steady, his breath even, only the slight tremble at his wrist betrays anything amiss. He remembers arriving here, remembers the rope rough around his wrists, remembers the overseer reading aloud from the ledger, male, 28 years, skilled, $600. Now, as he works, voices drift in from the quarters, songs and laughter, the clatter of spoons on tin plates, the low murmur of talk, stories the ledger cannot, will not record. In the office, overseer's attention lingers on the missing page, his eyes narrowing, as if he might divine from the scars of the spine what has been lost. He drums thick fingers on the blotter, glances toward the kitchen, where Samuel is counting the days, quietly, in his head. Accounts suggest that punishment was meted out in the morning, after the bookkeeping was done, before the workday began. The whip, the stocks, the branding iron, each had its place in the ledger. Each was noted in a column, tidy as the cotton rose. But when a man disappears, when a story is erased, nothing remains but the silence, the blank space between entries, the faint scent of ink and ash that lingers in the office. Samuel returns the cloth to the basin, the water clouded with grease and salt. He hears the overseer's chair scrape, hears the ledger snap shut. He does not turn to look. The plantation's secrets are held between the entries, in the missing pages, in the names crossed out and rewritten, in the ledger's spine that creaks when opened, like a gate in the night. Would you believe everything written in a book if you knew some pages had been removed? In Charleston, some stories are too bitter to keep, too dangerous to repeat. Samuel picks up a knife, tests the edge against his thumbnail, sharp enough to split paper, to cut cloth, to free a line from a page. He places it in the block, blade first, handle worn by years of use. The overseer steps into the courtyard, ledger under his arm, the sun beating down, the stones scoured white by salt and time. In the kitchen, Samuel stands at the window, his palms flat on the sill, the wood rough beneath his fingers. He listens to the rustle of the missing page, listens to the silence that remains. The truth is a prisoner, sometimes hidden in a ledger, sometimes spoken in a whisper, sometimes lost between the lines, between the creak of a hinge and the scrape of a quill, between the overseer's boot on the stair and the sound of the river, relentless, unknowable, turning the plantation's secrets over in its current, in the quiet dark beneath the dock. Samuel's life had always been measured in tasks, each one a ritual as old as the plantation. The morning after the first death, he washed his hands in the basin by the door, the water gray from kitchen sweat and ash, his skin puckered to a cold sheen. He paused a moment, feeling the weight of the lye soap, its crumble and scent. Beneath his fingertips, the ridges of old scars gathered the faint light. The kitchen was quiet still. The fire banked, the scent of last night's cooking layered over with something sharper, more metallic, anxiety, or the brine of anticipation, or perhaps just the salt ground into his palms from a decade of labor. He flexed his fingers, slow, deliberate, then reached for the coffee grinder, the crank handle worn smooth, the burrs turning more a shudder than a purr. He had returned from the sugar house as a boy, his mouth stained with stolen fruit, his ribs showing beneath a threadbare shirt. He learned early that silence was currency, that scars, if kept hidden, could be mistaken for strength. The cook, a woman with eyes hollowed by grief and labor, showed him the ways of the kitchen, how to stretch a little meal into a banquet, how to read the mood of the house by scent alone, how to keep secrets from the overseer's ledger by living between its lines. She had been sold, eventually her name scratched from the books, her stories reduced to rumor and half-told memory. Samuel remembered her hands, gnarled as oak roots, showing him the tincture bottle kept behind the molasses barrel, teaching him the line between medicine and misery. It was not fear but calculation that moved his limbs now as he stirred the pot of grits, the spoon's wooden handle rough against his palm, the porridge's burble steady above the coals, the kitchen's heat pressed close, the air thick with steam and the memory of meals past, the flavor of every victory and sorrow ground into the brick and mortar. The cook's absence had left a space, not filled but inhabited, turned over each morning with the rest of the kitchen's routine. Samuel's hands trembled now only in private, his heartbeat visible only in the careful way he set down a knife, the deliberate turn of a jar lid. He was seen, if at all, as a pair of hands steady, invisible, trusted. The overseer, if questioned, would say the kitchen had never run smoother. Accounts suggest that loyalty could not be bought, only borrowed. Samuel's had been taken again and again until it meant nothing at all. He ground a pinch of dried leaves between his fingers, the bitterness redolent of roots, of earth, of nights spent foraging beyond the garden wall, of his mother pressed close, her breath a prayer in the dark. He remembered the fever that took the overseer's child, the medicines whispered by a woman who spoke the Gullah tongue, the doctor's useless powders and incantations. He remembered the overseer's gratitude and the whip's kiss that still ached behind his knees in frost-bitten months. Samuel had learned, through the slow turning of the years, that kindness was a kind of debt, but cruelty was certainty itself. He arranged the carved spoons, the silver knives, the linen napkins in their iron rings. He filled the salt cellars, the grains clinging to his fingertips, tiny shards of sea or bone that stung the raw places where the lye soap had been laid in hard. The salt, like every other small torture, was meant to cure, to cleanse, to bring the rot to the surface. The cups and plates, the fat roasting on the spit, the tureen of oysters swimming in their own brine, each was both sustenance and instrument, vessel and verdict. The kitchen's order was a fiction, but Samuel maintained it anyway, out of habit, out of self-preservation, out of the old cold hope that there would be witnesses, that he would be more than the sum of his chores. Would you have watched him that morning, kneeling above the coals, his fingers poised above a pinch of white powder, his face calm as linen stretched to dry? Would you have seen the slow flex of muscle beneath his skin, the measured rise of his chest, the way a bead of sweat slipped behind his ear and vanished? The kitchen was a theater, the chores a play to be performed, the players rehearsed to the end of time. The overseer's boy, tousle-haired, peeped in from the scullery, hiding his smile in his sleeve as he snatched a bit of bread from the board. Samuel allowed it. The boy believed in kindness, not knowing it was a bargain struck long ago, when he was still curled against his mother's breast. The overseer's ledger, as ever, could not account for the human calculus. The boy's hopeful appetite, the widow's confusion, the doctor's frantic notes, the preacher's solemn hymns, it could not describe the way Samuel's pulse leapt in his throat at the sound of the overseer's tread, or the way he tucked the poison bottle into the heel of his boot, or the way grief and determination bound into a single knot at the base of his spine. The law, the ledger, the city, they might as well have been the wall against which Samuel pressed his brow each morning, testing its strength, looking not for weakness, but for sense. He lifted a cleaver, the blade as familiar as his own voice, and split the roast, the fat hissing as it seared. He seasoned it with care, his palms flat on the meat, working the salt and herbs into the flesh. The overseer's boy, restless, climbed onto the dough box, swinging his skinny legs, whistling a tune he'd heard the field hands sing. Samuel allowed himself a nod, a flicker of something almost like warmth, not pity, but memory, a relic of innocence that could not survive the reckoning to come. The pot boiled over. He scooped out the grease, his fingers scalded, his breath even. The kitchen hummed, a hive of secrets and routines, of knives sharpened and wounds kept hidden, of prayers whispered into the fat that dripped, unsanctified, onto the hearth. His hands, that morning, did not shake. As he lifted the roast onto a platter, as he wiped his brow with the back of his wrist, as the overseer's whistle sounded from the yard, Samuel felt, for a moment, the weight not of chains, not of the ledger's lies, not of fear or grief or anger, but of choice, of a man, for once deciding whose hands might be stained, whose memory might be marked, whose fate might be told. The scrape of the spoon against the cast iron sounded like a church bell, distant, measured, calling the island to attention. Samuel's hands, steady, stir. Samuel's hands, sure, bind, not just the roast, not just the future, but himself, the overseer, the boy, the city, every soul at the master's table, into a single, unbreakable story. There is a difference between rumor and event, between suspicion and certainty. Charleston learned this at noon, on the second day, when the heat leaned heavy against every door and window, and the garden party unfolded in a delirium of lemonade and wilted camellias. The overseer had moved the table beneath the oaks, where Spanish moss filtered the sunlight into pale, swaying fingers. The tablecloth, damp with humidity, clung to the wood, and the flies hovered in thick, sluggish clouds above the sweating glasses. The ladies fanned themselves with peacock feathers, their silk sleeves rustling, their gloves spotted with sweat and spilled cordial. The men, shirts undone at the throat, spoke in voices scraped raw from the night's drinking, their hands red with gin and sunburn. The children, barefoot and sticky, chased each other through the labyrinth of roses and boxwood, their laughter as sharp as the cicada's cry. Samuel moved among them, a shadow with a tray, his eyes cast down, his hands steady. He had dressed in his best shirt, unbleached cotton, faintly starched, the buttons mismatched from long use, and his face betrayed no more than a veil of sweat. The table was heavy with food, cured hams studded with cloves, translucent slices of melon, turings of turtle soup, baskets of cornbread leaking honey onto the cloth, the scent of basil and burnt sugar mixed with the musk of damp earth and the acrid tang of fear, though only Samuel could taste it. He carried the platter from the kitchen, its weight familiar against his forearm, the scent of roasted meat rising through the cloth that covered it. The overseer, his face flushed, waved Samuel forward, and Samuel served each guest in turn, his hands quick and practiced, his silence absolute. The second master to die was a man who liked to draw out dinners, to hold forth on politics and rice prices, to preside over toasts with a glass raised, his laughter too loud, his eyes too bright. He took a bite of the roast, chewed slowly, wiped his mouth with a napkin embroidered with his initials. He swallowed, drank, swallowed again, his lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. His face blanched, then mottled, his hands, roughened by reins and ledgers, clutched the tablecloth. A tremor passed through him. He pushed back his chair, the legs screeching on the flagstones. The circle of guests watched, momentarily hypnotized by the spectacle, as the master coughed once, twice, then slumped forward, his cheek pressed to the cloth, his fingers twitching in the crumbs and rose petals. The silence was quick, then broken by a woman's scream, by the overseer's curse, by the children's sudden bewildered stillness. Chaos is quiet at first, a held breath, then a rising roar. Samuel, unnoticed, stepped back, the tray still in his hands, his pulse a steady drum beneath the skin. He watched as the doctor was called, as the servants murmured, as the master's wife covered her face with a lace handkerchief. The scent of fear was thick now, metallic and sour, and the flies buzzed louder, drawn to the dropped fork, the overturned glass, the faint sheen of sweat on the master's brow. The overseer barked orders. The kitchen boys were sent to fetch water, to run for the sheriff, to lock the doors. The slaves, who had been scattered among the party, were herded into the sugar house, a brick building, windowless, its iron door clanging shut behind them. No one spoke. The air inside was thick with the sweetness of molasses and the tang of old sweat, the dust motes swirling in the single blade of light that cut through the barred window. Would you have noticed Samuel, if you had been there, standing at the edge of the garden, his face impassive, his hands empty now, the tray left on the sideboard, forgotten? Would you have marked the way his breath slowed, as if counting the seconds between the master's fall and the overseer's command? In the sugar house, the slaves sat on rough-hewn benches, their backs to the wall, their feet bare against the cool brick. They spoke in whispers, their voices swallowed by the weight of the building, by the certainty that whatever happened next would be measured in blood and silence. The preacher, a man whose face was lined with prayer and sorrow, began a slow hymn, his voice rising and falling like the tide. The doctor, meanwhile, knelt by the table, sniffed at the wine, tasted a sliver of the roast, pressed his fingers to the master's neck. His brow furrowed, he spoke quietly to the overseer, their heads bent together, their hands moving in quick, nervous gestures. The city's laws were clear. A slave accused of poisoning faced death, but only after trial, only after evidence, only after the ledger had been balanced one last time. The law was a net stretched taut. It caught only what was visible, only what could be proved by a white man's word. The doctor's fingers, ink-stained and precise, wrote his findings in a small leather-bound book. The symptoms, the timing, the possibility of poison. He looked up, scanning the faces of the servants, lingering on Samuel's for a heartbeat longer than necessary. The overseer, his face dark with suspicion, barked another order. The slaves were searched, their pockets turned out, their cots overturned. The scent of molasses and sweat mingled with the fear, rising like mist from their skin, from the damp bricks, from the locked door. Samuel stood apart, his hands loose at his sides, his gaze steady. He remembered his mother's voice, telling him to keep quiet, to watch, to wait, to let the stories tell themselves. He remembered the overseer's boy, peering through the cracked door, his eyes wide with confusion and curiosity. He remembered the cook, years before, teaching him the difference between healing and harming, between sustenance and silence. The sugar house was filling now with whispers and rumors, with the scrape of boots on brick, with the soft, desperate prayers of men and women who had seen too much, lived too long in the margins of someone else's story. Would you have fought, if you had been him, or would you have let the current carry you, as the river carries a branch, as the wind carries the scent of salt and burning sugar? The overseer's voice broke the stillness, calling for Samuel by name, demanding his presence at the table, where the dead man still slumped, his face turned to the sun. Samuel straightened his shirt, pushed open the door. The sunlight cut across his face, and for a moment, his shadow stretched long across the garden, across the table, across the body that no longer moved. The creak of the sugar house door was the only sound as he stepped out, his hands empty, his face calm, his heart a steady drum beneath the cotton. The overseer watched him, waited, wondered, and for a moment the scent of roses and funeral lilies and gunpowder hung over Charleston, suspended, as if the city itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next page to turn in the ledger, for the next story to be written, for the quiet, inevitable fall. Would you have heard the hush, if you had stood there, at the edge of the garden, at the center of the circle, at the door of the sugar house? The overseer, his hand on his pistol, his eyes on Samuel, waited for an answer, for a word, for a confession. Samuel, silent, watched the flies settle on the spilled wine, on the discarded napkin. on the cool, unseeing eye of the second dead master. The air was thick with salt and sugar, with fear and memory, with the scent of roses blooming, unchecked, at the edge of knowledge, at the border of silence, and the city, unaware, waited for the storm that had already begun. By the third day, fear in Charleston had a texture. It lingered in the soot that clung to the morning's wash basins, in the damp wool of the curtains drawn tight against prying eyes, in the stillness of the street where children no longer played marbles on the cobbles. The city's fury, once a rumor, now carved itself into the faces of patrollers and shopkeepers alike. Their boots struck the packed earth with a rhythm like a drumbeat, their voices hoarse from calling names and reciting laws. The air smelled of boiled coffee and candle wax. Church bells tolled for services no one attended. In the slave quarter, the usual murmur of morning chores was absent, replaced by the scrape of a broom over dirt, the occasional sigh of a woman rinsing out a ladle, the distant, uneasy caw of a crow perched on the overseer's roof. Samuel woke in the kitchen loft, his shirt stiff with dried sweat, his mouth parched. He listened. The usual sounds, the clatter of the cook's pans, the overseer's boy calling for the dog, the thump of the well bucket, were gone. The plantation, for the first time since the first death, felt exposed, a creature with its belly bared. Samuel padded down the narrow stairs, his bare feet silent on the treads, his hands brushing the whitewashed wall for balance. The kitchen, usually alive with the hiss of grease and the smell of rising bread, was empty but for the faint glow of a banked fire and the ghost of last night's supper. He dipped a gourd into the water jar and drank, the clay cool against his lips, the water tasting of river and iron. To the law, Samuel was now a suspicion given flesh, a name on a list, a man who could be summoned, searched, questioned. To the enslaved, he was a secret, a rumor grown louder than a shout, a story folded into the creases of palms. The men and women who had shared the sugar house with him last night watched him now with sidelong glances, their voices pitched low in the fields, behind the stables, at the kitchen door. He counted their faces, marked those missing, guessed at their thoughts. Some shrank from him, others edged closer, as if he carried a truth they could borrow for their own. Accounts suggest that the city's slave patrols doubled overnight, their lanterns scraping the darkness, their voices calling out, now and then, for Samuel by name. Children too young to understand but old enough to mimic repeated the call as they played at soldiers in the alleyways. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and river mud, of horse dung and crushed lavender, the breath of a city braced for bad news. In the kitchen, Samuel measured salt into a wooden bowl, his fingers trembling just once before finding the old rhythm again. The mill's stone creaked as he ground the day's meal, the sound harsh in the silence. Would you have hidden, if you were him? Or would you have moved through the days as if nothing had changed, trusting the fiction of routine to shield you from discovery? Samuel opened the pantry, the door's brass latch cold in his palm, and reached for the jar tucked behind the sugar sacks. Small, opaque, its mouth sealed with wax. He weighed it in one hand, then, after a heartbeat, returned it to its place. The overseer's ledger, left open on the table, showed the previous day's tally: bottles, barrels, bushels, laves, in a neat, indifferent hand. Samuel wiped his hands on his apron, the fabric scratchy from lye and sun. The rules of Charleston's slave code were clear, but their execution was at the whim of men who sweated in broadcloth and drank too deeply at noon. On the third day, the overseer summoned every man to the yard, their shirts patched and faded, their feet bare and dusty. He read from a list, called each name twice, watched each face for any flicker, any sign. Samuel answered when called, his voice steady, his hands loose at his sides. The overseer looked him over, grunted, and moved to the next. The sun beat down, unrelenting. The shadows at their feet were short, sharp, inescapable. A single fly buzzed at Samuel's temple, but he did not flinch. After the tally, the men were sent back to their chores, but the air was different now, charged with something unspoken. The women, too, went about their work, heads bent, voices hushed, their aprons swishing against broom straw and floorboards. In the barn, a foal nosed at its mother's flank, the mare stamping and snorting, her hide glossy with sweat and flies. The sound of the men's work, sweeping, carrying, hammering, hauling, was regular, practiced, but there was a tension in each movement, as if every gesture might be the last before the storm broke. Samuel, at the washtub, plunged his arms into the water, letting the sting of the lye erase the prickling of his skin, letting the rhythm of the work, scrub, rinse, wring, fold, carry him away from the place where fear and memory met. He thought of his mother, gone these 10 years, her face blurred by time, her voice remembered only in dreams. He thought of the preacher, who had counseled patience, and the doctor, who had looked away, and the overseer, who had not spared him a second glance. He thought of the city, its streets and shuttered windows, its alleys and taverns, its docks and churches, its ledger books and gallows. He thought of the silence that would follow, the quiet that would swallow his name, the way stories are lost in the turning of the years, in the shuffle of feet, in the scratch of a pen. Would you have told your story, if you could, or would you have let it fade into the air, into the rustle of leaves, into the quiet of the kitchen, into the scrape of mortar on pestle as Samuel, alone now, ground the roots into powder, his hands steady, his gaze distant, his heart a drum that no one else could hear? The plantation waited, the city waited, the law waited, but Samuel for the moment was still free to stir his own fate, to measure, to weigh, to decide. The sound of the pestle, grinding, grinding, was the only answer he would ever give to Charleston, to the world, to the storm that gathered, invisible, inevitable, just beyond the reach of the lanterns, just outside the door. On the fourth day, Charleston turned inward, its oak-lined streets hushed, its shutters latched, its church bells ringing only on the quarter hour, as if time itself had slowed beneath the weight of the sheriff's presence. In the overseer's parlor, amid the horsehair furniture and oil portraits of men long dead, the law was read aloud, not as warning, but as promise. The sheriff's voice was roughened by chew and brandy, the words measured, the vowels clipped. Any slave found to have administered poison to any white person, or to have conspired in such act, shall suffer death. The city's code had hardly changed since cotton and cane ruled its fortunes. The punishment for poisoning was always death, but rarely enforced, rarely spoken, until now. The parlor smelled of tobacco and beeswax, of sweat and old paper, of the fear that crawled up the spines of the gathered slaves. The sheriff's boots were black, polished to a dull shine, his spurs ringing faintly as he shifted his weight against the mantel. He lifted a key from his pocket, heavy, brass, chained to his belt, and placed it on the table, where it caught the lamplight for all to see. The slaves stood in a line, hands clasped, eyes down, breathing in the scent of tallow candles and leather, listening as the sheriff named their crimes, their duties, their fate. The overseer, arms crossed, watched them from the corner, his face impassive, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm against his biceps. Samuel had been moved from the yard to the root cellar behind the kitchen, a damp, windowless vault where potatoes and beets sprouted roots in the dark, where the air smelled of earth and mold in the buried past. He sat on a crate, his knees drawn up, his hands resting in his lap, his fingers exploring the splintered wood beneath him, the rough fibers, the sharp nails. The cellar was silent, but for the ticking of rats in the walls, the slow pulse of water in the cistern, the rattle of keys in the sheriff's pocket overhead. The law, in Charleston, was a thing of iron and ink. It moved through the city like the tide, relentless, indifferent, but not always predictable. The sheriff might hang Samuel tomorrow, or next week, or not at all. He might bargain for a confession, might seek out witnesses, might slip a key into the lock and set a price on silence. Accounts suggest that sometimes, after such storms, a sacrifice was required, not truth, not justice, but a body to quiet the city's fear, a name to inscribe in the record, a lesson for the living. In the cellar, Samuel listened as footsteps crossed the kitchen above, as the sheriff's boots scraped the stair, as the key scraped the lock. The sheriff stood at the threshold, his shadow pooling on the dirt floor, his breath sharp with whiskey, his eyes hard as flint. He asked for names, for stories, for anything Samuel might have seen, heard, known. Samuel shook his head, his voice calm, his pulse steady, his hands loose at his sides. The sheriff's key jingled, a soft metallic promise, freedom for information, a stay of execution for a name, a ticket north for a tale that fit the city's need. Would you have spoken, there in the dark, with a man's life, your own or another's balanced on the turn of a key? Would you have traded silence for a year, a week, a day of uncertain life? The cellar's chill crept up Samuel's spine, the damp settling in the creases of his shirt, the scent of old roots and wet earth sharp in his nose. The sheriff leaned close, his breath sour with tobacco, his voice barely above a whisper. He promised mercy, promised bread and bacon, promised the overseer's mercy, promised the sky beyond the plantation's edge. Samuel listened, eyes lowered, hands loose, his mind moving through the narrow passages of memory. His mother's face, the cook's warnings, the preacher's benedictions, the overseer's ledger, the city's laws, the key in the sheriff's palm. The law, in Charleston, was both trap and escape, both promise and sentence. The code was read aloud in the courthouse each Monday, each clause and penalty etched in black ink, each punishment, the stocks, the lash, the iron collar, the gallows, a warning and a dare. The sheriff's key was a relic, a tool, a symbol. It could open a cell or lock it forever. It could buy a man's life or sell it. In the cellar, the silence stretched, long, heavy, expectant. The sheriff shifted, sighed, tucked the key back into his pocket, where it clinked against his pistol. He turned, his boots scuffing the dirt, his shadow retreating up the stairs. The door clanged shut, the lock rasped, clicked, held. Samuel sat in the dark, listening to the drip of water in the cistern, the scrabble of rats, the faint echo of laughter from the street above. The city, beyond the cellar's walls, was preparing for judgment, for the trial, for the verdict, for the pageantry of justice, Southern style. Samuel flexed his fingers, felt the grit beneath his nails, the pulse in his wrists, the slow, steady beat of life. The law was a thing of iron, of ink, of lead, but memory was a thing of salt, of blood, of breath. In the silence, Samuel breathed, waited, counted the hours, the footsteps, the turns of the key, each one a rumor, a promise, a story that would not be written in the ledger, would not be spoken in the courtroom, would not be carved in the stone above the city's silent graves. Would you have remembered the key, there in the dark, or would you have let it fade, like other promises, into the shadows cast by candlelight and fear? In the cellar, Samuel closed his eyes, listened to the sheriff's boots above, to the clink of the key, to the whisper of the law, relentless, inescapable, turning again, in the lock. The city waited, the code waited, the silence waited, but Samuel for a moment was free, not to choose his fate, but to remember it, to hold it in his hands, to taste it on his tongue, to feel its weight, its edge, its shape, there in the dark, where the law could not reach, where the world was still, and the next turn of the key, the next turn of the page, was only as certain as a man's breath, a man's silence, a man's story, waiting, always to be told. A doctor's notes rarely see the light of day in Charleston, especially when the truth they scrawl might burn brighter than the fevered gossip of the market square. The plantation physician, Dr. Parrish, kept a small, leather-bound journal tucked in the inner pocket of his frock coat, its pages yellowed with age, its spine cracked with use, the ink blotted and often hurried, chasing the chaos of a city steeped in sickness and secrets. He was a man of science, of lancets and laudanum, of cures that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't, of observations noted in a hand that wavered only after midnight, when the lamplight flickered and the night grew long. Samuel, locked in the cellar, could hear the doctor's boots on the staircase, the muffled scrape of the key, the heavy sigh that preceded each visit, each inquisition, each pause before the sentence would be written. The diagnosis entered, the man condemned. Dr. Parrish smelled of carbolic and cloves, his hands scrubbed pink, his fingernails rimmed black from ink and tinctures. He had treated slaves and masters alike, bled women in childbed, dosed children with paregoric, stitched wounds with catgut and cursing. In the days after the poisonings, he moved through the grand houses like a shadow, his coattails rustling, his satchel heavy with powders and vials, his eyes darting from the dead to the living, from the sickbed to the sheriff's eager face. He examined the bodies where they lay, the mouths slack, the pupils fixed, the skin clammy with the sweat of death, and in each case, he lifted the eyelids, sniffed the lips, tested the dregs in the cups, tasted a crumb from the plates, and wrote, in his careful slanting hand, the symptoms, the timing, the possible causes. The doctor was a practical man, a student of nature and necessity, but even he could not ignore the pattern, the sudden seizures, the vomiting, the coldness of the extremities, the bitter almond scent that clung to the breath, if only for a moment, before the spirit fled. Poison, he wrote, was possible, probable, even, but poison, by whose hand? The kitchen, the cellar, the pantry, each held utensils enough, each hid jars and bottles enough, each hosted hands unremarked, eyes downcast, hearts beating beneath the linen of their shirts. The city's laws demanded proof, not rumor, not suspicion, not the silent weight of a ledger, but evidence, testimony, a witness who would speak, a hand that would sign. Would you, in the doctor's place, have written the truth in your journal? Or would you have let the ink run dry, the page stay blank, the story go untold? Parrish sat at his walnut desk, his quill poised over the page, the lamp's flame steady, the night silent but for the scuttle of mice in the wainscoting, and the distant, uneasy cry of a whippoorwill. He thought of his oath, of his place in the city, of the families who sent for him in the night, of the slaves who bowed as he passed, of the sheriff's hunger for a name. He wrote, then crossed out, wrote again, hesitated, then blotted the ink with his sleeve. The story could be told in many ways. The masters had died of natural causes, of bad air, of spoiled food, of a summer fever that swept through the city, carried by the river wind. Or they had been murdered by the hands of the invisible, the powerless, the ones whose names were entered in the ledger as property, not people. Accounts suggest that Dr. Parrish had seen cruelty enough in his years. He had attended the sick in the slave quarters, had set bones broken by the overseer's lash, had wiped the sweat from the brows of women in travail, had listened to the stories of suffering that never made the ledgers, never reached the papers, never entered the law. He knew the city's secrets, its shames, its silences, but he was a man of his time, of his place, grateful for his position, wary of scandal, eager for the approval of the men who paid his fees. And so, when the sheriff came calling, when the questions were asked, when the journal was demanded, Dr. Parrish handed it over, his hands steady, his eyes cast down, his voice quiet, betraying nothing. The sheriff read, nodded, took the book, and left, the boots ringing on the stair, the door closing with a soft, final thud. But the doctor was not finished, not quite. In the hours after the sheriff's visit, Dr. Parrish sat at his desk, the lamp guttering, the air close, the scent of ink and old paper thick in his nostrils. He took a fresh sheet, dipped his pen, and wrote, not a confession, not an accusation, but a letter. He described what he had seen, what he suspected, what he feared. He folded the letter, sealed it with wax, addressed it to no one, then, after a moment's pause, dropped it onto the coals. The paper curled, blackened, turned to ash, the truth disappearing in smoke and the soft rustle of burning. The doctor watched, his face expressionless, his hands steady, until the last ember faded, until the air cleared, until the night was silent again. Would you have burned such a letter? Or would you have sent it north, entrusted it to the river, slipped it beneath a minister's door? In the cellar, Samuel waited for the sheriff's return, for the doctor's word, for the key in the lock, for the sentence that would follow. Above, the doctor sat in his study, the heat oppressive, the night heavy, the scent of burned paper lingering, the weight of his silence a burden he could not shed. The city, beyond the window, slept, its secrets buried, its stories half told, its justice a thing of parchment and power, of evidence and erasure. The doctor's journal, now in the sheriff's hands, would never be read aloud in court, never be pinned to the church door, never be whispered over the bodies in the potter's field. The truth for now was ash floating, weightless, settling where no one would see it, where no one would speak it, where no one would remember. Samuel, in the dark, listened for the sound of boots, for the rattle of keys, for the hiss of a match, for the whisper of a page turning. He waited, his breath slow, his hands loose, his mind tracing the paths the truth might take, through the doctor's pen, through the sheriff's ledger, through the city's streets, through the river's mud, through the ashes in the grate, through the stories that would never be told, through the silence that would always remain. The night was long, the air close, the scent of ink and fire and memory thick in the dark, and the city above slept on, dreaming of justice, of vengeance, of the next turn of the key, the next scratch of the quill, the next silence that would settle, heavy and unbroken, over Charleston, over the plantation, over the cellar, over the man waiting, listening, dreaming, remembering, his hands steady, his voice silent, his truth, for now, ash. Plantations run on numbers, not stories. The overseer's ledger is a ledger, not a history. Charleston, 1839. In the plantation office, a thick volume lies open on the desk, its pages ruled in neat columns, its spine split with years of use. Here are tallies of cotton bales, of hogsheads of sugar, of bushels of rice, of gallons of molasses. Here are lists of tools, axes, hammers, and of livestock, horses, mules, pigs, chickens, dogs. Here are records of births and deaths, of illness and recovery, of labor and rest, of men and women bought and sold, their worth calculated to the dollar, their stories reduced to a name, an age, a price. Here is the world made small, made simple, made safe for the men who keep the books and guard the gates. The overseer, a man of square shoulders and bitten nails, dips his pen in the inkwell, blots the excess, and writes. His breath is visible in the early morning chill. His boots leave prints on the sanded floor. The window is open a crack, letting in the scent of magnolias and river mud, the sound of a thrush calling from the live oak, the creak of the gate as the hands file in from the quarters. The ledger is his Bible, his map, his weapon. It tells him who is missing, who is late, who is sick, who is well. It tells him nothing of the dreams that trouble a man's sleep, of the songs sung low in the dark, of the stories told in whispers, of the silences that stretch between question and answer. Samuel's name appears in the ledger, as it has every day for 10 years. Samuel, age 28, cook, value $600. Nothing more, no mention of the scars that ladder his back, of the nights he has spent listening to the river, of the mornings he has salted meat and counted hours, of the days he has watched children grow and mothers vanish, of the meals he has prepared for men whose names are written in marble and men whose names are written in dust. The overseer licks his thumb, turns the page, finds the entry for yesterday, strikes a line through Samuel's name, and writes confined in a careful looping hand. The ink is black, the line is straight, the story for now is simple. A man is absent, a man is confined, a man is waiting. Would you have read your own life in such a book? If the words were all that remained, would you have felt the weight of the numbers, the cold finality of the columns, the silence between entries? The overseer closes the ledger, slides it into the desk drawer, locks it with a small brass key. He steps out into the yard, squints at the sun, sniffs the air for rain, listens for the sound of the fields, the kitchens, the stables. The plantation is quiet, but not still. The hands move through their chores with a slow, practiced rhythm, their voices low, their eyes down. The overseer watches them, marks their movements, counts their steps, calculates their worth by the sweat on their brows, the dirt on their hands, the steadiness of their labor. The plantation is a machine, and the ledger is its governor, its regulator, its silent, unblinking eye. The overseer is not a man given to reflection, but even he feels the strangeness in the air, the sense that something is amiss, that the numbers no longer add up, that the world is fraying at the edges. He returns to the office, unlocks the drawer, opens the ledger, flips through the pages, searching for a pattern, for a clue, for a name that stands out, for a line that is too straight, too clean, too simple. He finds nothing but numbers, names, dates, sums, the story of the plantation, compressed, condensed, made safe for the men who rule by ledger and law. He closes the book, locks the drawer, pats his coat for the key, and leaves, his boots ringing on the floorboards, his shadow stretching long across the yard. In the kitchen, the women work in silence, their hands busy with dough and knives, their voices stilled by fear and memory. The children, too, are quiet, their games suspended, their laughter dampened, their futures written in the margins of the ledger, in the spaces between the lines. The cook, a woman whose face is lined with years and whose hands are rough with lie, watches the overseer pass, her eyes following his path, her mind calculating the distance between the office and the cellar, between the ledger and the law, between the story that is told and the story that is lived. The ledger leaves gaps. It does not record the songs sung in the quarters, the prayers whispered in the dark, the stories told around the fire, the names of the missing, the lost, the sold, the dead. It does not record the taste of salt on a man's lips, the weight of iron on his wrists, the sound of a key in a lock, the scent of burning paper, the silence that follows a question, the silence that precedes an answer. The overseer returns to his rounds, his boots scuffing the dirt, his keys jingling at his belt, his ledger locked away, his numbers safe, his world for now intact. Would you have trusted a book to tell your story if the book was written by another man's hand, if the entries were made in ink that faded, if the pages were brittle with age, if the spine was cracked with secrets, if the story was always in the margins, always in the silence, always in the spaces between? In the cellar, Samuel sits, his hands loose in his lap, his back against the cool bricks, his mind moving through the days, the names, the numbers, the stories, the silences. He listens for the sound of the overseer's boots, for the creak of the office door, for the rustle of the ledger's pages, for the turning of the key. He waits, his breath slow, his heart steady, his story, for now, unwritten, unspoken, waiting, always waiting, for the next turn of the page, the next scratch of the pen, the next silence that will settle, heavy and unbroken, over the plantation, over the city, over the world that is made safe by numbers, by columns, by ledgers, by laws, by everything except the truth. Would you have tried to write your own story if the book was locked away, if the pen was not yours, if the ink was not yours, if the silence was all you had? In the office, the ledger sits, closed, locked, silent. In the cellar, Samuel sits, waiting, listening, remembering. In the quarters, the men and women move through their chores, their lives, their stories, their silences. In the city, the church bells ring, the river flows, the sun rises, the world turns, the ledger is opened, the numbers are tallied, the story is told, the silence is broken, for a moment, for a breath, for a life, and then, always, again, the page is turned, the key is turned, the silence returns, and the story for now is unfinished, unwritten, waiting, always waiting, for the next turn of the page. Justice in Charleston is a stage, and the courthouse is its theater, a room of white columns and dark wood, of leather-bound law books and juries of property owners, of the sharp scent of beeswax and the slow creak of ceiling fans. On the morning of Samuel's trial, the city wakes to rain, the streets gleam, the gutters churn with murky water, the air holds the chill of a storm passing but not gone. The courthouse yard is crowded, men in broadcloth, women in silk, children clutching biscuits, slaves from neighboring plantations brought in to witness, to learn, to remember. The sheriff marches Samuel through the throng, his wrists bound in hemp, his shirt clean but frayed at the collar, his expression unreadable behind the rain that beads on his brow. Inside, the court smells of damp wool and ink, of sweat gathering beneath starched collars, of the iron bars at the windows flecked with rust. The jurors take their seats. 12 men, their faces sunburnt or pale, their hands swollen from labor or soft from ledgers, their eyes scanning the room, the accused, the crowd, the law laid out before them. The judge, his robe black as crow's wing, enters without ceremony. The room quiets. The only sounds are breathing, the sputter of a wick in a lamp, the rain on the roof, steady and insistent as time. Samuel stands in the dock, his back straight, his hands loose at his sides. The law in this room is clear. A slave cannot testify against a white man, nor for himself. His voice, by statute, is air, heard only in the timbre of his silence, in the quickening of his breath, in the occasional swallow that catches in his throat. The prosecutor, a man with ink-stained cuffs and a voice honed to a blade's edge, reads the charges. Poison, murder, conspiracy, the words hang in the air, thick as the humidity. The prosecutor calls witnesses, the overseer, the sheriff, the doctor, each swearing to facts, to times, to symptoms, to the ledger's record, to the law's demands. Their testimony is relayed as if through glass, distant, warped, untouchable. Would you, in Samuel's place, have searched the faces in the gallery, the overseer's boy, the cook, the preacher, the men and women whose lives turn on the hinge of this verdict? Would you have sought a flicker of recognition, of kinship, of fear, even as your own face remains a cipher? Samuel listens, his eyes on the floor, his lips pressed together, his breath steady, measuring as ever the distance between truth and story, between silence and speech, between the law and the world beyond its reach. He knows, as every man in the room knows, that justice is not a search for truth, but a ceremony of order, a ritual of power performed to soothe the city's nerves, to seal its ledgers, to silence its ghosts. Accounts suggest that the doctor's testimony is halting, his words careful, his hands trembling as he describes the symptoms, the timing, the possibility of poison. He does not look at Samuel. He does not need to. The prosecutor reminds the jury of the law, of the consequences, of the need for certainty. The overseer, when called, recites the names, the dates, the tallies, his voice flat, his eyes on the ledger open before him. The sheriff, his hat in his hands, recounts the search, the confinement, the key turned in the lock. The judge, his brow furrowed, listens, nods, scribbles a note, taps his pen against the desk. The air in the room is thick with the scent of damp cloth and old paper, with the weight of expectation, with the knowledge that this story, for all its heat, its noise, its hunger for an ending, will end as such stories always do, with a verdict written in ink, not blood, with a sentence passed, not spoken, with a man condemned, not known. The defense, a young lawyer with spectacles perched on his nose and sweat on his upper lip, rises, clears his throat, speaks of doubts, of gaps in the evidence, of the city's hunger for a culprit, of the law's demand for proof, not presumption. He gestures to Samuel, who stands mute in the dock, his face a mask, his eyes downcast. The lawyer's words are precise, rehearsed, earnest, but the law is a wall, and the wall is thick, and the jury's faces are stone. The prosecutor replies, his voice rising, his words sharp as a splinter, his gaze sweeping the room, the jury, the judge, the accused. The rain drums on the roof. A gust rattles the shutters, the lamp flickers, casting long, trembling shadows on the oak-paneled walls. Would you have believed in justice if you had stood where Samuel stands, if your voice had been silence, if your story had been written by another hand, if your fate had been decided by men who do not know your name, your pain, your dreams, your truth? In the gallery, the cook twists her apron in her hands, the preacher bows his head, the overseer's boy chews his lip, his eyes wide, his future unwritten. The jury retires to deliberate, a word that means to weigh, to consider, but in this room, in this city, in this time, it means only to confirm. They return too soon, their faces blank, their hands clean. The foreman stands, clears his throat, reads the verdict, guilty. The judge nods, consults the code, declares the sentence, death by hanging. The gavel falls, a sound like a rifle shot, like a bone breaking, like a door closing, like a story ending. Samuel, in the dock, does not move, does not cry out, does not protest. He stands, his back straight, his hands loose, his breath even, his eyes on the floor. Then for a moment, on the gallery, on the faces he has known, on the lives he has touched, on the city that has never known him at all. The courtroom empties, men and women filing out, their voices lowered, their collars turned against the rain, their hands clutching handkerchiefs, their stories trailing behind them, unfinished, unspoken, waiting in the silence, in the air, in the space between breath and breath. The sheriff takes Samuel by the arm, leads him down the narrow stairs, through the courthouse yard, past the crowd that has come to see, to bear witness, to remember, to forget. The rain has stopped. The sun breaks through the clouds, casting the city in a pale, uncertain light. Samuel walks, his wrists bound, his steps measured, his gaze steady, his silence absolute. The air is thick with the scent of wet earth and cut grass, with the sound of a bird calling from the live oak, with the weight of a city's judgment, of a law's certainty, of a story's end, written in ink, sealed with a gavel, spoken in silence, waiting, always waiting, for the next turn of the page, the next turn of the key, the next silence that will settle, heavy and unbroken, over Charleston, over the plantation, over the courthouse, over the man who stands, silent, in the dock, waiting, always waiting, for the next breath, the next word, the next story, his own and not his own, written always in the air. The morning he is to hang. Samuel wakes in darkness. The jail cell smells of damp straw and old iron, of unwashed bodies, and the faint, astringent tang of lye. He sits up, rubs his wrists where the rope has left its mark, listens to the slow drip of water from the eaves, the distant, muffled bustle of the courthouse yard stirring to life. The sheriff comes before dawn, his boots scraping the stone floor, his lantern casting a juddering circle of yellow light on the wall. He unlocks the cell door, clears his throat, averts his eyes. Samuel stands, stretches his arms, rolls his neck, small, familiar motions, as if this were any morning, as if the world had not narrowed to this moment, this cell, this silence. They walk through the courthouse yard, the grass wet with dew, the air cool and heavy, the sky streaked with pink and gray. The crowd is already gathering, men in hats, women clutching shawls, children hoisted onto shoulders for a better view. The scent of frying bread and coffee drifts from a nearby stall. A dog barks, someone coughs. The sheriff's grip on Samuel's arm is firm, not unkind, as if he too is caught in the ritual, the necessity, the weight of the law's final word. They pass under the live oak, its leaves shimmer, catching the first light. The scaffold looms ahead, raw, unfinished pine, the wood pale against the dark earth, the noose dangling motionless, waiting. The preacher meets them at the foot of the steps. His face is lined with sorrow and something like defiance. His Bible is worn, its edges softened by years of handling. He murmurs a prayer, his words low, almost lost beneath the murmur of the crowd, the shuffle of feet, the distant cry of a jay. Samuel bows his head, not in piety, but in acknowledgement of the man, of the moment, of the silence that has carried him this far. The preacher's hand is cool and dry on his brow. The scent of lamp oil and old paper clings to his sleeves. They climb the steps. The wood creaks beneath their weight. A splinter catches on Samuel's bare heel. He does not flinch. He stands on the platform. The boards rough underfoot, the noose before him, the sky stretching wide and indifferent above. The crowd is quiet now, a sea of faces upturned, eyes bright with curiosity, with fear, with something like hunger. The hangman, a man Samuel has never seen before, his face obscured by a hood, his hands steady, adjusts the rope, tests the knot, steps back. The sheriff reads the sentence one last time, his voice flat, the words falling like stones into a pond. Samuel listens, his breath even, his hands loose, his gaze steady, not on the crowd, not on the sheriff, not on the preacher, but on the horizon, where the sun is just beginning to burn away the mist. Would you have looked away if you had been there? if you had seen a man stand in the gallows shadow, if you had heard the hush before the drop, if you had smelled the pine and the sweat and the fear, would you have closed your eyes, or would you have watched, as if your gaze could hold him, could save him, could remember him? Samuel lifts his chin, feels the rough hemp against his skin, tastes salt on his lips, from sweat or tears, he does not know. The wind picks up, rustling the leaves of the live oak, carrying the scent of the river, of the city, of the world he is about to leave. His pulse is steady, his mind clear, his hands at his sides, his back straight. He does not speak, he does not need to. His silence is his story, his refusal, his witness. The preacher steps forward once more, offers a final blessing, a whispered plea for mercy, for remembrance. Samuel closes his eyes, breathes in the scent of wood and dust and damp grass, the lingering trace of bread from the market stall, the faintest hint of magnolia carried on the breeze. He remembers his mother's face, the cook's hands, the overseer's ledger, the doctor's burned letter, the sheriff's key, the city's noise and silence, all of it woven into this moment, into this breath, into this final unbroken silence. The hangman adjusts the hood, the rope tightens, the crowd holds its breath. The last thing Samuel sees is a bird taking flight from the magnolia tree, its wings beating against the sky, its cry lost in the wind. The drop comes sudden, final. The rope jerks, the wood groans, the crowd exhales, a sound like the sea retreating, like a door closing, like a story ending and beginning. The body swings, limp, silent, the morning sun casting its shadow long across the yard, across the faces of the living, across the city that has judged him, condemned him, forgotten him, remembered him. The preacher murmurs a song. The sheriff turns away. The crowd disperses, their voices rising now, their footsteps hurried, their eyes averted, their hearts racing, their memories already rewriting what they have seen, what they have done, what they have allowed. Would you have stayed if you had been there, to watch the body cut down, to see it wrapped in rough cloth, to follow it to the potter's field, to mark the place with a stone, with a prayer, with a story? Or would you have turned away, as most did, as the city did, as the law did, as history does, letting the silence settle, letting the story fade, letting the memory blur, until all that remains is the shadow, the rope, the bird, the breath, the silence? In the courthouse yard, the sun climbs higher. The gallows stand empty. The rope swings gentle in the breeze. The scent of pine and dust and damp grass lingers. The sound of a child's laughter rises, sharp and bright from the market square. The city goes on, its ledgers, its laws, its stories, its silences. Samuel's name is entered one last time in the overseer's book, then crossed out, then forgotten. The rope is coiled, stored, saved for the next man, the next story, the next silence. The bird, unseen now, calls once more from the magnolia tree, its cry echoing over the roofs, over the river, over the city, over the world that has judged and been judged and will judge again. Would you have heard it if you had been there, in the gallows shadow, in the silence, in the space between breath and breath, between life and death, between story and silence? The city does not answer. The rope does not answer. The bird does not answer. Only the silence remains, heavy and unbroken, over Charleston, over the plantation, over the courthouse yard, over the gallows, over the man who stood there, once in the morning light, his hands loose, his breath even, his story, for now ended, but not forgotten, not quite, not yet. Memory is what the city keeps, and what it forgets. Charleston does not speak of Samuel again. Not in the grand houses, not in the market stalls, not on the street corners where men gather to talk of politics and weather and the price of cotton. His name is struck from the ledger, his story folded into the silence that follows every act of violence, every verdict, every public display of power and of fear. The gallows stand empty now, the rope coiled, the wood bleaching in the sun, the stain where his body swung the only mark left, and even that will fade beneath the rain, beneath the feet of men who pass, and do not look up. In the days that follow, the city returns to its rituals. The weighing of cotton, the tallying of hogsheads, the signing of deeds, the raising of toasts. The air smells of honeysuckle and horse dung, of salt from the river and tar from the docks, of bread baking in the ovens, of the slow, sour stink of fear pressed down beneath routine. The overseer rides the boundary lines, checking fences, counting heads, noting absences and replacements, his horse's hooves leaving faint crescents in the damp earth. The ledgers are balanced, the stories are revised, the city's memory is sealed, as tidy as a shroud, as final as a law. But in the slave quarters, where the cabins lean together like old friends sharing a secret, Samuel's story does not end. The women whisper him to sleep at night. The men invoke his name at the edge of the firelight. The children dare each other to say it aloud at midnight, to see if his ghost will answer. The stories are never the same twice. Sometimes he is a trickster, sometimes a martyr, sometimes a man who wanted only to go home, sometimes a spirit who walks the riverbank, looking for the key to his chains. The stories grow in darkness, watered by silence, rooted in the earth that holds his body, unmarked, unclaimed, unremembered by the city that judged him. Accounts suggest that after such storms, Charleston forgets, or pretends to forget, to move forward, to bind its wounds with laws and ledgers and prayers. The city's amnesia is an act of will, one story replaced by another, one silence layered over another, one memory overwritten by the next. The overseer's records are clean, the courthouse's verdict is final, the doctor's notes are burned, the preacher's eulogy is vague, the sheriff's key is turned. The city's story is safe, its justice is served, its order is restored. The past is a thing to be buried, like Samuel's body, like the truth, like the secrets that cannot be spoken aloud. Would you remember, if you were there, the taste of salt passed hand to hand, the scent of damp earth after rain, the sound of a hymn hummed low in the dark? Would you recall the man at the gallows, the silence in the kitchen, the missing page in the ledger, the ashes in the grate, the stories whispered in the quarters, the silence that followed, the silence that remains? In the slave cabins, the stories are kept alive, not as history, not as fact, but as memory, as warning, as hope, as a bridge between the living and the dead, between the spoken and the unspoken, between the world that is and the world that might yet be. The city's feasts continue, the roasts carved, the wine poured, the toasts raised, but the salt is always there, in every dish, in every mouth, in every memory. The kitchen hands move through their chores, their eyes down, their voices low, their hearts heavy with stories they cannot tell, with memories they cannot share, with a past that is always present, always pressing, always waiting to be unearthed. The overseer's boy, grown taller now, with his mother's eyes and his father's gait, asks the cook one evening, as she salts the meat, "Who was Samuel?" She pauses, looks around, leans close, and tells him not the whole story, not the truth, as it happened, but something close enough to remember, something just enough to keep alive, something to pass on, hand to hand, breath to breath, memory to memory. The plantation goes on, as plantations do, as cities do, as nations do, its fortunes rising and falling, its ledgers filling and emptying, its stories told and untold, its memories kept and forgotten. The river runs to the sea, cradling the city, carrying the dead, whispering to the living, singing the old songs, waiting, always waiting, for the next story, the next memory, the next silence. Would you listen, if you could, to the stories told in the dark, to the songs sung at the edge of the fire, to the memories passed hand to hand, breath to breath, silence to silence? The city does not listen, the overseer does not listen, the law does not listen, only the earth listens, only the stories remain, only the memory endures in the salt, in the silence, in the space between the lines, in the quiet at the heart of Charleston, in the stories that will not die, in the silence that will not break, in the earth's memory, unmarked, unbroken, unspoken, waiting. Dirt has a memory of its own. After the body is cut down, wrapped in burlap and carried beyond the city's edge, it is buried in a place without stones, without markers, without candles. The men who dig the grave, convicts, slaves, strangers paid in silver, work in silence, their shovels biting the damp clay, their breath steaming in the morning chill. The scent of turned earth rises, thick and fungal, mingling with the salt air off the harbor, with the burnt sugar stink of the refinery, with the wood smoke drifting from the kitchens. The preacher says a psalm, his voice low, his Bible limp in his grip, his words almost lost beneath the shuffle of feet, the snort of a mule, the distant, mournful call of a heron. The sheriff watches, hands folded, hat in hand, boots scuffing the mud, his duty done, his conscience clean, his ledger balanced. The grave is filled, the dirt is patted flat. The men walk away, leaving no sign, no story, no name. The city's forgetting is a kind of violence. In Charleston, memory is measured in marble and in ink, in the names chiseled above church doors, in the portraits hung in parlors, in the deeds filed in courthouse drawers. For Samuel, there is nothing, no stone, no date, no epitaph, no epithet. The earth that holds him is anonymous, unremarkable, a patch of ground indistinguishable from any other, its only distinction, the absence of memory, the refusal of witness. The overseer's boy, curious, asks the preacher where Samuel is buried. The preacher, after a long silence, shakes his head, says only that the dead belong to the earth now, that the city has its laws, that the world has its ways. The boy, unsatisfied, runs to the edge of the field, looks for a mound, a marker, a sign, but there is nothing, only grass, only dirt, only silence. Rain erases what men will not remember. In the nights that follow, storms roll in off the Atlantic, soaking the fields, washing the paths, filling the grave with water, then with mud, then with the slow seep of time. The scent of wet earth and rot drifts through the slave quarters, through the kitchen, through the overseer's office, through the city's dreaming streets. The rain drums on the roofs, rattles the shutters, spills from the gutters, carries the stories of the dead down to the river, down to the sea, down to the places where stories go to be forgotten. The preacher, in his study, burns his notes, the paper curling, blackening, crumbling to ash, the smoke thick and bitter in the close air. The doctor, in his parlor, pours himself a drink, stares at the fire, lets the memories blur, lets the stories fade, lets the silence settle. The overseer, in his ledger, makes one final entry, then closes the book, locks the drawer, pockets the key, his duty done, his conscience clean, his world intact. But memory is not so easily erased. In the quarters, the women tell stories at night, not of Samuel's death, but of his life, of his hands, of his silence, of the meals he cooked, of the salt he measured, of the days he counted, of the hope he carried, of the choice he made. The children listen, wide-eyed, mouths sticky with stolen sugar, hearts full of questions, of fears, of dreams. The men, at the edge of the fire, add their own details, their own rumors, their own memories, of the overseer's ledger, of the sheriff's key, of the doctor's burned notes, of the preacher's silence, of the city's forgetting. The stories are never the same twice, never fixed, never final, always changing, always growing, always alive in the telling, in the listening, in the remembering. Would you have told such stories if you could? Or would you have let them fade like the stain on the gallows, like the scent of rain on dust, like the silence in the ledger, like the ashes in the grate? The city does not answer. The law does not answer. The overseer does not answer. Only the earth answers, in the worms that turn the soil, in the roots that push through clay, in the birds that call at dawn, in the river that carries the stories away, in the silence that remains, unbroken, unspoken, waiting. Accounts suggest that after such storms, life goes on, as it must, as it always does. The plantation's routines resume, the fields are planted, the cane is cut, the cotton is weighed, the ledgers are filled, the stories are told, the silences are kept. The overseer's boy, grown taller, with his mother's eyes and his father's restless hands, walks the boundary lines, counts the livestock, watches the river, listens for the stories that no one tells him, for the silence that no one explains. The cook, her hands rough with lye, her back bent with years, salts the meat, seasons the stew, hums a hymn under her breath, a sound almost like memory, almost like mourning, almost like hope. The law, the ledger, the city, they can erase a man's name, but they cannot erase his story. In the kitchen, the salt is passed hand to hand, from mother to daughter, from cook to child, from one generation to the next, a taste of memory, a sting of truth, a promise of something more. In the quarters, the stories are told at night, around the fire, beneath the stars, in the hush between breath and breath, in the space between the spoken and the unspoken, in the earth's memory, unmarked but unbroken, silent but alive. Would you remember, if you could, the unmarked grave, the rain on fresh-turned earth, the preacher's psalm, the doctor's fire, the overseer's ledger, the cook's salt, the stories told in the dark, the silence that remains? The city does not remember. The law does not remember. The overseer does not remember. Only the earth remembers. Only the stories endure. Only the salt remains, a taste on the tongue, a memory in the silence, a story that will not die, a silence that will not break. Rain falls, the river rises, the earth turns, the stories live, the unmarked grave is lost, but the memory is not. The city forgets, but the earth does not. The law is sealed, but the story is not. The silence is deep, but it is not empty. The child, hands cupped, catches the rain, asks again, "Who was Samuel?" And the cook, hands steady, passes the salt, begins the story again and again and again, in the earth's memory, in the silence, in the space between what is written and what is remembered, between what is said and what is known, between life and death, between salt and silence, between story and memory, between the grave and the living world. A year turns, and Charleston feasts again. The 4th of July dawns clear, the air thick with the mingled scents of gunpowder, roasting pork, and the briny breath of the tide. Children race through the streets, their hands sticky with molasses, their laughter echoing off the cobbles. Men in broadcloth gather beneath the oaks, their voices raised in toasts to liberty and remembrance, their glasses clinking, their faces flushed with wine and sun and ritual forgetting. In the great houses, tables groan beneath platters of ham and oysters, baskets of bread, bowls of peaches swimming in syrup, silver pitchers sweating with lemonade. The city is a pageant of forgetting, mirth over memory, noise over silence, spectacle over truth. In the plantation kitchen, a new servant salts the meat. She is young, her hands unmarked, her eyes bright with curiosity and caution. The copper pots gleam, the hearth crackles, the scent of cinnamon and lard and sizzling fat fills the air. She moves from task to task, grinding coffee, setting the table, stirring the soup, her apron crisp, her sleeves pinned neat, her face a mirror of propriety and fear. She does not know Samuel, except as a name whispered in the dark, a story traded beneath the stars, a caution murmured in the hush between chores. She salts the roast, measures the meal, counts the hours, just as he once did, just as countless others have done, just as generations will do, their hands steady, their voices low, their stories untold. The kitchen is order and silence, routine and ritual, hope and resignation, all folded together, pressed down, smoothed over, as familiar as the grain of the table beneath her palms. Would you taste the memory in every bite, if you could? The salt in the stew, the bitterness in the coffee, the story in the silence? Would you listen for the past, in the murmur of the kitchen, in the shuffle of feet, in the creak of the pantry door, in the rustle of the overseer's ledger, in the hush that follows every toast, every celebration, every act of forgetting? The city does not listen. The guests do not listen. The law does not listen. Only the kitchen listens, only the earth remembers, only the silence speaks, in the taste of salt, in the weight of iron, in the sound of a child's question, in the space between stories, in the place where memory and forgetting meet. The plantation's routines are unbroken. The fields yield, the ledgers fill, the seasons turn. The overseer rides the boundary lines, counts the heads, notes the absences, replaces the losses. His horse's hooves leaving crescents in damp earth, his voice carrying on the wind, his ledger balanced, his world intact. The preacher delivers sermons on forgiveness and forgetting, on moving forward, on leaving the past behind. The doctor prescribes dross for sleeplessness, for fever, for the ache of memory. The sheriff's key chimes at his belt. The law's shadow stretches long. The city's forgetting is a performance, a ritual, a necessary fiction, a story told and retold until it becomes truth, until it silences the questions, until it erases the names, until it buries the past beneath the weight of celebration, beneath the gloss of tradition, beneath the fiction of reconciliation. But in the quarters, after dark, the stories persist. The women gather their children close, tell them of Samuel, of the poison, of the gallows, of the silence that followed, of the earth that holds him, of the city that forgot. The men, at the edge of the fire, add their own details, of the sheriff's key, of the doctor's burned notes, of the overseer's ledger, of the cook's salt, of the memory that endures in spite of forgetting, of the story that will not die. The children listen, wide-eyed, hearts racing, mouths sticky with stolen sugar, innocence and knowing colliding in the space between story and silence, between memory and forgetting, between the world that is and the world that might yet be. Would you pass the salt if you could, or would you hide it away, bury it beneath the floorboards, let it gather dust in the pantry, let the story fade, let the memory die? The city passes the salt, hand to hand, feast to feast, generation to generation, unthinking, unfeeling, unknowing, its hands clean, its conscience clear, its ledgers balanced, its world intact. But the earth does not forget. The kitchen does not forget. The quarters do not forget. The stories do not forget. The silence does not forget. The past is a poison and a promise, a memory and a warning, a story and a silence, always present, always pressing, always waiting to be tasted, to be heard, to be remembered. The feast continues. The toasts are raised, the glasses clink, the laughter rises, the city celebrates. But in the kitchen, the salt is always there. In every dish, in every mouth, in every silence. In the quarters, the stories are told, again and again, in the dark, beneath the stars, in the hush between breath and breath. In the fields, the earth turns, the crops grow, the rain falls, the river rises, carrying the stories away, carrying the memory forward, carrying the silence into the future. The past is not past, the story is not over, the silence is not empty. The child, hands cupped, catches the rain, asks again, who was Samuel? And the cook, hands steady, passes the salt, begins the story, again and again and again, in the earth's memory, in the silence, in the space between what is written and what is remembered, between what is said and what is known, between life and death, between salt and silence, between story and memory, between feast and forgetting, between the world that is and the world that might yet be. Would you taste the memory in the salt, if you could? The city does not answer. The law does not answer. The overseer does not answer. Only the earth answers. Only the kitchen answers. Only the stories answer. Only the silence answers. In the child's question, in the cook's hands, in the salt passed down, in the story beginning again, in the silence that remains, heavy, unbroken, waiting, always waiting, for the next hand, the next question, the next story, the next silence. The feast goes on, the city feasts, the world feasts, but the story is never over, the silence is never empty, the memory is never gone. The past is always present, always pressing, always waiting to be tasted, to be heard, to be remembered, in the salt, in the silence, in the story, in the earth's memory, unmarked, unbroken, unspoken, waiting.